Hi, my name's Jesse. I'm the Managing Director here at Horizon Digital. Thanks for joining us on our Own the Edge podcast series, where we talk to people working in technology who are using technology to help own the edge, gain a competitive advantage in their industry, and generally do interesting things. So today we've got Murray from Digital X. Welcome.
Thanks, Jesse. Good to be here.
That's good. Thanks. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for giving up some time. Today we're going to sort of talk about some lessons from startups and what sort of approaches do startups take in terms of building products, and how could bigger businesses and enterprise sort of leverage that in their organisation. So something that I'm really interested in. It's something I've looked into over the years, and I know you've got a long history in this space as well. So looking forward to it. It should be really interesting. So to get started, why don't you just give us a bit of background on why technology? Why do you like it? How did you get into it? What does it sort of mean to you?
Sure, yeah. So I've been in the industry a long time. That'll probably come out during the course of the conversation about how long. But I think my dad was a kind of electronics engineer and a sound and audio and visual engineer. So I kind of been exposed to some of that technology for a while. But when I was young, my cousin actually got right into the early stages of kind of personal computing with an Apple II. And I remember him getting right into that, and I was like, I don't know, I enjoyed it.
Does he still have it?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think so.
It would be worth a bit.
It would be. It was an Apple IIe Euro Plus edition. I think it was kind of the top of the range at the time, and it was a big investment.
Yep.
And I remember mostly being interested in the games as a teenager, and then he was showing me some coding and stuff, and I thought, I'm not sure about this. I played around a bit. I learned to code a tiny bit, but it just didn't resonate with me. I was the mindset for me was, I'm not sure that I want to be behind screens kind of doing this green screen coding all day, even though I enjoyed the results. So it's funny, I actually remember just before I went to uni where I did a business degree, I was thinking, technology is not for me. I'm not going to do computer science or engineering or anything. I'm going to go into business and marketing, and I'm more interested in kind of customers and people. But then I ended up back in technology almost by default, because I think when I actually went to university, it was just kind of when the internet was starting to break and everything was moving towards kind of online client server, the very early days of those technologies. So we were using tech in university. We had to do all our assignments on PC, and all that was kind of pretty new. I was probably one of the first intakes who went through university who I got an email address. I could do some online chat with people overseas. So it was probably that ability to use technology and see maybe where it was heading. That was interesting.
Yep.
And when I qualified and left, the tech industry was just taking off. It was kind of heading towards that Y2K phenomena, and the internet was starting to become a business tool as opposed to some sort of fringe kind of emailing type thing, chat rooms and things. So I think it's more been about what technology can do and how it can change the way business happens and the way people work, so I kind of always come at it more from that sort of people's perspective, service delivery.
Yep. More from the business side and the problems that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, and the user experience.
What the actual technology is.
Yeah. And so I like tech, but I definitely wouldn't consider myself a super early adopter, and I don't code. But I kind of like architecture as well. So I think for me, understanding the building blocks, how you can put things together and making some decisions to build things that deliver results. And tech is just the ubiquitous tool set that's been the biggest, sort of curve, if you like, exponential curve, probably since the 40s and 50s.
Yep.
And it keeps on rolling. So that's sort of the background. But I still remember going, I'm not going to do this tech thing. I'm going to go into business. And about 3 years later, I was back in tech by default.
It's pretty similar to my background. I mean, when I was at uni, I remember getting my first email address, which was a terrible email address.
Mm-hmm. Mine was all letters and numbers and
we had to get journal articles, and I had to drive around to all the different universities and photocopy them. There was nothing online, and it's just changed, so quickly. And I wasn't an early adopter in technology at all. But I fell into it more on the business side and on the people side as well. And it's just, technology is kind of like what we use to solve problems, but it's, solving sort of people problems or business problems.
Yeah.
So in terms of sort of experience with startups or that sort of startup sort of mentality and sort of thinking, what does building like a startup mean to you? And leading into what sort of lessons could enterprise learn, and how could they sort of adopt some of that sort of mindset? And there are some differences. When you're in an enterprise, you're generally you've got revenue, you've got customers, but you've got more sort of regulation, you've got sort of more admin on top of things. So you've got some parameters, you've got some real strengths that you can leverage, but then you've got some more sort of things that you have to, that sort of might constrain your sort of operations a bit. So what does that sort of look like for you?
Yeah, great questions. I think at its core, to me, what startup means is constrained funding and no customers. So that might sound a bit generic, but I think you can certainly have startups in established industries and established spaces, and they come in and they're trying to effectively deliver a different way of doing the same thing. Occasionally you have startups that are really like pushing the envelope in terms of things that have never been able to be done before, which is kind of rare. But so for me, it's less about what industry you're in, or whether it's trying to find a whole new segment, or just simply do something much better, much differently for an existing kind of segment, or if you like, disrupt an existing kind of play. But I think one of the key characteristics of startups versus enterprise is that kind of limited budget, no customers, or certainly very few customers. So you're kind of bootstrapping to a degree. You're really looking for finding your customer, making sure that you're solving some kind of problem, delivering some kind of value, but you don't have, as you said, almost like the luxury of falling back, particularly on large amounts of funding and kind of pre-approved projects that would let you sort of wander on for years without necessarily nailing that problem solution fit for a customer. That's certainly part of it for me. And the other element is being able to move and pivot quickly as you learn things, and to not be too constrained by the thinking of what you're delivering already. It's almost that ability to go, we don't mind if we start off heading here and then we have to move over there, but on the basis of some evidence, not just changing your mind all the time.
Someone's opinion or No, I think you've sort of nailed it there. I think the constrained budget, I think that's it's not it's kind of overlooked, but to me, the way a startup works is they raise some money. That money is limited, and then they'll sort of work backwards from there in terms of, okay, we've raised $1 million or whatever, and our spend rate, we've got 12 months. So it drives a time frame, and it's a real hard end. Like if you don't get to a point where you've demonstrated something, you've learned something, you've got some value, or you started getting revenue, you can't get additional funding. So I find the more around like the fixed time frame and the real hard end is what just drives people's decision making and prioritization, because you see too often when people take more of a project approach, or in a bigger business where it's too easy to extend the time frame, or it's too easy to get additional budget or let things slip. Then they, these sort of approaches, we need to do everything, and
bigger
don't
enterprises, they have a standing budget. They go, we spend $10 million a year on innovation anyway. If it's a really big business, so you kind of know there's an operating envelope of money that's there all the time potentially, and that's very different.
It doesn't drive you to prioritize things, and I think you can just start. You can focus on things that don't actually make a difference. I feel like the limited time frame is really good for. It's amazing when you say someone comes to you and says, "I want to do all of these things," and you go, "Yeah, great, okay," but you can only do half of them in 3 months. Then they all of a sudden. It's amazing how quickly they can actually prioritise and get down to something they could deliver in 3 months. All right, cool. So in terms of, so constrained funding, and, the other thing you were talking about in terms of, having no customers and looking for, delivering some sort of value, and there's more of a sort of a learning aspect to it. Like it's generally, and this is kind of a little bit different with enterprise as well, with startups. You sort of start with a premise around a problem, but how you can solve that problem, or if it's delivering enough value, or if you can, generate enough revenue from solving that problem, is kind of like there's a lot of unknowns around that. So that's where you're starting with enterprise. sometimes it's a bit clearer what the value could be. So, but you can still take the same sort of approach, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going in to sort of take that mentality into an enterprise, what would be some things around like big businesses have sort of traditional team structures and hierarchies? What are some things that maybe you could take in? What would a different team structure look like? And what are some of the sort of biggest sort of cultural changes and shifts that you would have to make?
Yeah, they're great questions. And I think there's a few models that have been tried kind of over the years and a few sort of typical approaches to that. I think partly you can look at the enterprise itself and say, is there value in changing the way the enterprise approaches delivering more value to customers and or entering new markets, and look to try and structure and streamline the whole enterprise and maybe take different organisational models to the bigger business, and that's the sort of thing that certainly we were doing some of that at Bankwest with the Blaze model and looking to deliver effectively value streams within the business, kind of adopt agile delivery methods and very customer centric, and bringing business and tech people together at scale in the enterprise. So that's one approach, and that can certainly be done, but it requires a lot of commitment, quite a lot of time, potentially quite a big investment, because you're looking to make the whole enterprise a bit more startup in nature, if you like,
yes.
or certainly a ability to respond more quickly to market opportunities and demand. So that's one pathway. I think that's a bold one. I think it can be done. Other ways, typical sort of approaches and ones that I've been involved in as well is where you would say we can set up a substructure or a parallel structure or kinds of an arm's length unit, either as a fully part of the business, or you might partner up with someone or have an acquisition. And I know people like Commonwealth Bank and others have taken that road, just kind of have a business unit which is funded differently, governed slightly differently, set up with those sorts of constraints we talked about in terms of funding access and certain focus areas. So you almost have that incubator approach.
Yep.
There's a few different ways of doing that. I think, although I don't have lots of data that I can point to, that just trying to set up an incubator within an existing business has challenges. Sometimes that almost arm's length business with a different brand and maybe even some partnering can be a more effective model to deliver that. I think there are some challenges in terms of setting up teams differently within existing structures that I've seen. I can talk to that now if you like, or we can get to that. But there are pros and cons to those models as well.
Yeah, I think with things like where you set up, say, an incubator or you set up a team and say your function is innovation, I don't see it really working that well, because you can't just say to someone, okay, now you just go think up ideas. I think the best ideas come from people that are closest to the problem. So you're better off trying to set up a process where you sort of surface those ideas a bit more organically, and then you take the people that know the problem closer to the customer. They're going to be the best ones to help solve it, and then you build a sort of like a cross-functional team around them to help deliver something, or test it further. And I don't know, what are your sort of thoughts on that sort of approach?
No, dead right. I think there's a couple of things in there as well. It is also, context is so important in all of these things, as far as what's the objective that the business or the unit is trying to achieve. And if that's a case of it's pretty close to the core enterprise value proposition, so similar market, trying to look at ways of maybe expanding revenue or improving margin or doing things differently but roughly within the same domain, versus branching that business into a whole new area that it hasn't gone before. And in which case, particularly if you're in that, like, how do we adapt this business for the future? How do we continue to serve customers but in better, newer ways, more competitive ways? Then I think you're dead right. Like, you don't want to distance yourself too much, and the people who are on the coalface and who are in that business have a lot of that good intel about what is working and what isn't working, and maybe what competitors are doing. So you definitely, when I'm saying incubator, I'm not a fan of innovation units. I mean more incubators set up to attack certain areas that have been identified as something that the business wants to achieve. And then some of the things I think that I've seen. So I was part of one of those incubators where we kind of understood the problem space fairly well, and then it was partly being driven, that was in the energy sector, was partly being driven by external forces, which is often what forces businesses to change, which was the whole advent of rooftop solar and distributed energy reserves and people wanting to connect large amounts of their own generation to the electrical network. And the business knew that problem was coming. It was well documented and researched, and was like, how do we handle that? And so I think in that case, having an incubator type approach was good because there was a problem to focus on, like you say. But I think some of the things to be careful of, if you like, is not to let that become an ivory tower type construct within the business. And it's like, oh, that unit's very special. They don't have to go through governance. They get to play with all the fun stuff. And I think it's super important to manage that structure. There are ways like rotating people through that incubator, so it's not just a chosen few that go off for 2 years.
Because they're the sort of things that make it go wrong, is that people what is this? People start worrying, are they going to lose their jobs? What are they doing? It's this kind of
internal
stealth
competitive
ops type stuff.
Internal competitive tensions, and also this, there is, I think it's kind of well documented in literature, the enterprise also wants to try and stamp that out potentially as well, perhaps because people with internal governance might feel a bit threatened by new ways of doing it. So I think it's risky for both, but I think where it can work is where you have, as you've mentioned, something to shoot for, not just an open-ended.
Go dream up ideas.
And I've often said it's like, I actually don't like idea generation. I'm much more interested in harvesting problems. And so I'd rather have if I'm going to go out to the business, I'd rather have a problem box than a ideas box. It's like, just tell me what's not working or what you're worried about in the future, and say to people, what are you seeing that's not working or could be done better, and tell people, please don't tell us how to fix it yet, like that'll come later, but just look for the things that you see today or coming down the line that look like they're going to be problems. They're going to impact customers, they're going to impact revenue and impact shareholders, they're going to maybe put us out of business if we don't do something about it, and harvest that. So set up units to focus on that, but definitely make sure there's accountability, that everyone knows that the incubator is being held to account, and how you do that's a bit different potentially than a traditional operating unit. But to me, there's transparency, accountability, so people understand this unit has an objective, it's being measured, it's got purpose and governance. It's just maybe a bit different from the standard operating model, but those things are still in place. And I think allow free communication, transparency, and maybe mobility of people, attach people in and out. You don't want to disrupt teams too much. I know there's a concept of sticky teams, but I think there's also great value in different ways of pulling in ideas and keeping the two connected. And it's almost a sales pitch. You're kind of pitching to the business the value of that incubator unit, and vice versa, pitching to the incubator unit the value of staying connected to the business. That said, I think it can be different if you're really saying, we're a mining company, but we want to move into, I don't know,
new energy,
green energy, take the Fortescue example. Even then, I'm not 100% sure, but I think there's more justification for an arm's length kind of pretty standalone business that you might set up and run if you're really wanting to move into a different sector.
Okay, that's good. There's a couple of things out of that. So I think I like that concept of framing it around problem generation rather than idea generation, because, ideas are easy, right? Anyone can chuck an idea, and you see these things like one of the worst examples I've seen was a government organisation that had like a idea generation type platform where you just chuck in ideas and then they went through a process of like, okay, put in your ideas and then you can vote for it and the best one will implement. And so someone put in an idea around that they wanted to wear shorts in the office and they end up winning. And then it's come through and then the CEO or someone's going, we're not doing that, and just killed it. So like idea delivering no value to the business and then the executives have killed it. So then people are like, well,
what was the point?
What's the point?
Not listening to us.
So you just wasted all that effort. You've actually gone backwards rather than adding delivering any benefit to the business. So that sort of idea generation versus problem generation versus idea generation I really like. And the other thing you sort of brought up, and I see this a bit as well, and provide some comment on it, is separating out what's continuous improvement from BAU to what is like new innovation or like new products or new streams, because quite often I've seen these things go wrong is that you lump in like an innovation team or something and it gets real confused around what's BAU, continuous improvement. Well, yes, you want to keep on getting better, and there's a role in technology, and there's a role in things around how do you do your core business better. But then I think it's a different approach, and there's different different team structures, different mindset to like a pure new innovation team where you want to build something that's a new growth opportunity. So I'm not sure, have you got any sort of thoughts around that or any experience with that?
Yeah, I think all of these things are on a spectrum as well, like a continuum, if you like. And I remember having this conversation with people like, what's a product versus what's a service? And there's sort of characteristics you can look at and kind of lay those things out. And there's also, what's innovation, because potentially you can have small improvements that are ideas that have impact. And that's probably okay. That's probably a form of innovation. I think often we tend to think of it as disruptive innovation, real dial turner stuff, which is big scale in terms of its impact, and that's a relative scale depending on the size of business you're in.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it doesn't have to be disruptive. It can be into a new market. I think what happens with that sort of continuous improvement innovation sort of spectrum is that the way that they measure continuous improvement is like dollars saved, or it's generally around efficiency or reducing costs. Yeah. And the innovation is generally, it's not so much around reducing costs or efficiency. It's about creating new growth opportunities. So they're very different, but they get lumped together quite often.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. I probably hadn't quite thought of it that way, but yeah, and disruptive, I can't really believe I used the word because it's overused, but I guess I probably just thinking of that in terms of scale of impact. Like what's the potential of this to really move the needle in some way, shape or form. I think the concept that innovation is more around growth is okay. I tend to favour, and innovation's sort of part of my portfolio at Digital X, and it's kind of interesting because I keep a register. So I keep a register of basically the problem spaces and the ideas that we're going to look at them. And some of them are pretty small and pretty conventional. And I think there's often some internal debate going, well, so I mean, we're a kind of Web3 company. We focus on how we might apply decentralization and blockchains and some of those emerging technologies to solve challenges in the financial space, essentially. But we still have Web 2, if you like, or more traditional online services that we provide. So we provide a spectrum. But I think there's often a case internally where we think it's the Web 3 stuff is where our innovation lies, pushing that boundary, new services, attacking new markets. And that's largely true. But equally, there are smaller pieces in there of just going, hey, we can take a digital product and make it available through more conventional channels, which is a little bit of a kind of about face on what you might normally do, but it actually represents growth potential. I tend to favour innovation cultures though, where the whole business is encouraged to innovate, and I think there can be some dial turners on cost savings. I think if you look back and go, people who have come up with, say, automated control systems for their business that might have been, replaced a whole bunch of manual infrastructure within a manufacturing environment, could probably be considered innovative in that it may flow through to increased revenue because you can improve your output, but it could cut, if you could cut 25% of cost out of your business through deploying AI and yet not service any new markets, it's probably up there in that high impact area. So I think maybe think about it in terms of scale of impact, whereas if you say tweaking the cost base is 0.5% and essentially serving the same number of customers is much more in that continuous improvement zone. Yes. So I'd probably frame it in terms of the impact potential, and growth is a good one, but I think there can be impact of going, our market share may stay quite similar, but we might radically improve profitability. And to be honest, that probably drive growth eventually anyway. Those are maybe the kinds of things that spring to mind. But I think if possible, where there's a culture of not standing up innovation units, certainly maybe making a couple of people focus in that area and providing some KPIs, but encouraging the business to innovate, even in a small way, and then just deciding, almost like you say, how you manage that. Is that more of a continuous improvement? Do we have to resource it, or can we just kind of bake that into our standard process, or do we really need to attack it and fund it and govern it differently, because it's going to be it has the potential to be a dial turner, and you have to prove that out before you commit resource.
I mean, I think businesses should be doing both. I think it's just you just got to be clear on how you measure it and how you resource it, what your expectations are, because they are different things.
Yeah. And I guess I'm just passionate about not building the ivory tower thing, that innovation is somehow special and better than the rest of the business. It's different focus, different governance, but to me it should be, if it's in an enterprise context I'm talking about, not a startup, obviously. That's a different...
Yeah, I mean, there's been some pretty big, sort of digital transformation projects that have spent millions and millions of dollars, but they've taken that, they seem like it's building empires within an organisation. It's all secret, it's all stealth, and they just fail. They just don't deliver anything. It actually ruins culture.
Yeah, super sad. I think transparency for me is really important. Like, there's obviously certain commercial things you can't share, particularly if you're really developing core IP, in a true R&D sense. But I think in many cases you can be more transparent than you think you can.
Yep.
Or than people. And I think finding ways to be transparent and really maintaining accountability for those transformation programs and looking for success indicators, treating it like anything else, just, is it delivering to objectives, is it adding value, gives you so much better outcome than these kind of secret units that hold stuff very close and where the funding is kind of a black box. And
I definitely agree. So sort of related to that, in terms of what type of sort of different mindset do you sort of need to embrace, and particularly around what sort of how you take risk and how do you sort of deal with failure. Because it's different in a startup environment to an enterprise environment. So what sort of things you sort of see maybe need to change, or how could you sort of incorporate those aspects to and manage it within a sort of larger organisation?
Yeah. Okay. So we're still talking enterprise context, but innovation and new kind of product development. Risk is a great way of framing it. I think I do believe, to a degree, in that kind of lean startup approach, which is if you're looking to solve a problem in a new way, or you're looking to do something significantly different, you start off with a lot of uncertainty, and the main risk is that uncertainty. You don't quite know if it's worth solving that problem, and if there's a real potential at the end of that path, and how much time, effort, and resource you should be committing to that. Equally, I think you need to understand what's the potential opportunity cost or future cost of not pursuing something, especially if there's an external shift that you believe is real. So that thing of like, what's our cost if we don't do something and our competition do, or someone comes along and actually does that.
Yeah, there's always an option to do nothing. But
there is, right. But I think opportunity cost, or cost of like long-term sitting on your hands, is usually not as well surfaced maybe and defined and measured and thought about. So there can be like a massive cost to just pursuing your existing business model. We know that, right? Big players that go under because they just go, we kind of dominate this market. We'll just do continuous improvement.
Yeah, they get complacent.
And but in terms of how you manage that, and I might have gone off the thread a little bit, but I think some of the things are there is to identify what the types of risks are that you're going to encounter with that innovation or transformation stream, and they're different risks usually than your BAU risks. So they're probably less around, there can be things like operational risk and financial risk in those environments, but that's probably more in the enterprise core space. I think the real risks are open-ended investment that doesn't deliver value, so the risk of sinking cost and not actually delivering value or achieving value. So for me, the macro risk, as with all of those things, including startups, is drip feeding funding in for long periods of time and not actually achieving a value delivery. So that whole piece about don't be afraid of failure, but be afraid of long, expensive failure. Like, I think it's okay to fail, but I don't think it should be aspirational to fail. You should always want to succeed and do everything you can to succeed. So I do think some of the rhetoric in the last few years have gone as like, hey, embrace failure. It's like, you learn from failure.
Yeah,
it's inevitable. But
I probably shouldn't have said failure because I actually don't really like it. It's more like, what can we learn? Yeah, like focus on the initial
focus on learnings.
It's learning focus rather than that thing. I'll fail quickly. Well, you don't necessarily want to fail, but if you learn, well, you haven't really failed, right?
And it's interesting. Like we've both been around a bit, and I use the disrupt word, which I don't necessarily like. And you've used it, but it people use that word, and it does bake into your mind, and you repeat things often. So definitely, I think that the focus should be on like how do we learn fast and de-risk systematically and do things in chunks that try and maintain that startup flavor of constrained spending. Try and set an envelope, really work hard to stick within that envelope, really work hard to come out of it at the end with some learning that is part of that systematic de-risking. And I'm actually a believer in process, like hardcore process and governance around innovation. And I've run into mixed feelings in my roles over time. I think some people go, it should be like about creative and about play and stuff. I mean, there's an element of that in terms of how you solve the problem. But at the end of the day, if your objective is a commercial outcome and a customer and shareholder value prop, like cycling through a regular process, checkpointing and always customer feedback, user feedback and market comparison, very regular type feedback to make sure, because I do think the biggest risk, there can be regulatory risks and things like that for sure. You got to also be super, and I think I personally believe, but I'm not technical, I personally believe that the technical risks are often easier to solve and getting easier and easier. Like the ability now to spin up technology and deploy tech stacks and actually throw technology at scaling is incredible. I mean, the ability to I think these days, if you find a value proposition that really resonates and you think there's a big market, the resources that you can get now, obviously you have to have money, but you can spin up, AWS and Google and just like insane amounts of technology that used to take teams months and months and really long periods. So technical risk there is, but I think certainly in our business, and if you look at things like banking, anything that's a highly regulated industry, you need to keep one eye on your legal and compliance risk, and that's often a really big barrier, really hard one for enterprise. And I think Uber's the classic example. Is like, well, they didn't have to worry about taxi licenses and stuff. They just went for it and built up a war chest if they needed lawyers to defend that. But you couldn't do that if you're an existing, say, transport company that has regulation. And you got
to play by different rules.
It's really hard, right? Yep. So I think that's another thing which is tough, genuinely tough for enterprises to innovate in those big dial turner ways versus a competitor who comes in without that existing overhead, if you like, and the ability to really push the envelope and maybe almost sidestep regulation, or even regulation has to play catch up with them. So that's a really long answer, but I think still the biggest risk to me is just investing continuously over time and then not ever really achieve your problem solution fit and your solution market fit. And so keeping a real eye on that, super important.
Yeah, I think like if you look at startups, the number one reasons why a startup fails, not because they couldn't build something, it's because there was no market for it. I think the stats are like the top reason is there's no market. Second reason is no money, which generally also means that there was no market, that they couldn't get more funding because they couldn't get to a point where they could prove something. I think that's probably it covers probably 60-70% of reasons why startups fail, and it's that process of what we see in sort of our business is that people come in, they have an idea, they have something that they want to solve, and then they jump straight to, okay, well, I can build an app that does X, Y, and Z, and they start with the technical solution, and they miss this bit in the middle. It's like, okay, well, like, is it even a problem worth solving? And that's the sort of, when you talk about process, people have this sort of like, there's this myth that innovation and sort of new businesses come from some like moment of inspiration, or you just have an idea in the shower one day and then you turn it into a multi-million-dollar business. It very, very rarely happens like that, but they're the ones that you sort of hear about, and that sort of they make like nice romantic stories. But the actual thing is, there is a process to like, how do you go and validate things? How do you go and talk to customers? So maybe could you talk a little bit more around like what that process looks like? Like, you don't have to go into too much detail, but so if you're going to start out and you're in a big business and you've got something that you're trying to solve, what would kind of that process look like from your sort of perspective and your sort of experience with this?
Yeah, I think first thing is to try and make that assessment of what you're shooting for, sort of what you alluded to earlier about how big a dial turner is this, and how close is this likely to be to what we do today, but just maybe a different way of doing the thing versus really stepping outside the dots of our current product and service offering. So really going after a whole new market, moving from, shoes and fashion and things like that into electronics. Yep. Whatever the case may be. It's like how so understanding that firstly, I think just trying to get a little bit of a sense, even if it's early days, of really how much are we looking to diverge from what we do today versus staying roughly in that market and just looking at a whole different way of servicing that market, or understanding its evolution to the next version of that market. So probably starting with that context in mind and trying to get a sense of where you're orienting, that helps you set up that structure and have that right level of connection with the business. And then I'd probably go with that lean startup method in its broadest sense. I never love being a slave to methodology. It's more like the principles of that methodology. Yes. So I like to take and encourage a principles-based approach, which would be going, okay, we want to set up a process, and that sort of lean startup process, the one that I've been involved in, is firstly it's a proof of problem stage. So it's just gather evidence that the problem is real or has potential to be real, and it doesn't have to be exhaustive evidence, but some kind of data, and the more external the data, the better.
And it doesn't have to be high tech. It can be talk to some customers is generally the starting point. Yeah. And there's a lot of people don't even get out the door and go talk to some potential customers or end users in an enterprise context. Your customers might be people that are in the field who are operational. Yeah. Get out and talk to them and validate whether that problem exists, how big of a problem it is.
Get outside your walls. A while ago when I was in a role just before I joined Digital X, we had a pretty successful, entrepreneur come in and talk to us who'd done, startups, achieved scale and actually exited those. And there's not a lot of people, and I got to put hand on heart, I haven't worked for a true startup. I've worked for some early stage scale ups that already had some product market fit and some revenue and some financial backing. So I'm certainly not the person who's gone out there and bootstrapped something from my garage. Those are amazing people to me who can really take that approach. But I asked deliberately the question in front of the team because we had reached a fairly sizable organisation already at that level. Yep. We had a lot of firm views internally of what it was that we wanted to have as an impact on the market. And I asked him, I said, what is the most valuable thing that you use to make decisions around where you're going to go with your ideas and product? And he's like, feedback from outside your walls. Mm-hmm. It's like external feedback is 10x more valuable, at least, than internal views and opinions. So seek that feedback. As you say, it can be pretty qualitative initially.
Yeah, it's the easiest starting point.
But any data, so it's that prove the problem. And some people really don't love that language, and I get it. I also, when I first got into the space, I thought, it's an opportunity, not a problem. And that's fine, but we know through human psychology people respond to pain and the removal of pain much more than people respond to, hey, you could potentially have this better future. So even just from that perspective, my view is most things are solving some kind of a problem at heart, and don't get worried that it's negative language. I don't mind if it's called opportunity, but as long as we focus on that evidence that it is a real issue or a real gap, even if you like, in the market, something that's not being well addressed today. So problem, gap, whatever. But for me, the risk with opportunity is you go too quickly to solution. So that's that first stage, is kind of prove that out and go, yeah, there's an issue here. And then look at the market and go, why is it not being well addressed? Or are there other people that are on the trajectory to addressing this? Like, are we aware of anything out there that's already got a head start, if you like? And then the next step would be, how could we solve it? So doing some of that idea generation, but then very quickly back testing that against the problem. So it's that like kind of proof of problem, and then it's like proof that we've got some sort of an idea solution, if you like, that actually matches that problem set, that has a shot at solving that. And that's where your iterative development process comes in. Prototyping, I'm a big fan of prototyping in its broadest sense, but basically put something in front of your intended audience, user, customer base, and get their views on that. And that can often be theoretical. I've found like you can go and have a conversation with someone and say, so we think there's this kind of issue, and you've kind of told us that that's an issue or something you'd like to be able to do. What if I could do this thing for you? Like, what if I could, you don't even have to say how, it's just like, what if I could tell you which of your customers were most likely to leave in the next 3 months? And people go, well, that'd be awesome. Right? So, okay, so then you're onto something. You don't even necessarily have to build that yet. Obviously, you should have an idea in your head of how you might achieve that, so you're not just
you want to make sure it's
smoke
feasible.
and mirrors, right? So a little bit of feasibility. But I'm a big believer that these days, particularly in the tech space, there's a lot of potential to solve those problems. But so that's that next step, and then it sort of goes broader about, okay, how big's that market? Like, how pervasive is that problem? Is it something quite niche? Is it something high value or low value? And so to get a sense of scale, not in terms of how quickly you can scale, but how does the market scale? Is it local? Is it global? And really, again, look back at what other people are doing so that you don't lose sight, because it's easy to lose sight of what potential competitors might be, where you sit. And then the final step is, okay, we've kind of got evidence of a problem. We've also got evidence that we've got some ideas that people would like, that we think that would turn the dial and that are worth investing in, and we think the size of the market is something like this, that gives you an envelope to invest, and then within that, I advocate for releasing funding in small tranches, very well defined stage gates, and similar to any kind of project, but they're different stage gates, and the gates are much more around feedback, evidence, and sense of de-risking the idea, as opposed to budget, time. There's no value to me in going, well, we were at month 3 and we said we'd do these many sprint points and we said we'd build this prototype.
It doesn't mean anything.
And so, it's like, it really doesn't mean anything. But if you say we've done prototype 1, customers have told us this, we were quite surprised. We thought they had this problem. They don't. They got this other problem. We don't know if we should go ahead. But if we do, we're going to have to reinvestigate. Again, we're going to have to come up with a different idea. And then the team can look at that and go, actually, that's a pretty interesting problem. We'd like to continue to invest, even though that's the stuff. It is quite qualitative, but you can always back it with data. And the best data is customer quotes, user interaction, and emotion, which is hard for people. But in my previous role was sort of mining engineering, our product sponsor, our SME, if you like, when we fleshed out the idea, I saw a moment where he lighted up. He's like, man, that would have made my life so much easier when I was a site engineer, like so much easier. And you can see the emotion. And I was like, okay, so let's go and talk to one of your counterparts who's not in the business. We got a video hookup with a lady out of Canada, a really good mine engineer, talked through and said, like, if we could provide you this kind of insight, how helpful would that be? She was like, wow, really helpful. It wouldn't solve all my problems, but it would give me a really good starting point. And you could see the emotion. And it's not like, you can see when people don't really care. You go, if I could do A, B, and C for you, and they go, generally it's okay, but you're probably not likely to get a whole lot of revenue or bang for buck from solving those problems. Yeah,
you see that with it's probably a bit more on the continuous improvement side. But when I sort of talk to businesses that are looking at implementing something, we're like, why do you want to do this? And they're like, we'll save X amount of time. Like, well, it's kind of like it's not enough. People don't care enough about it and they don't believe it enough. And so you really got to dig deeper into, what is the actual value? And it's normally It might save some time, but what that does is that it gives us information quicker. It gives us information in a day rather than 2 weeks. So then we can make better investment decisions or project decisions or what is the actual value that it's driving rather than if it's just saving time, people don't care.
Yeah. And I often use the corollary of that, which is almost that opportunity cost thing I mentioned in reverse. And again, in that example with the mining engineering solution that we were looking at, is to say what could be done with that time. And so in particular, we were looking to save time or provide shortcuts for quite highly skilled people that were quite rare, like very experienced kind of mine operations, mine planning, people who could connect those two dots. And so if you were saving them a day or two of troubleshooting and a day of meeting preparation in a month, doesn't sound like a lot, but then if you say to them, what would you do if you had 3 clear days every month that you right now were spending on troubleshooting and meeting prep? The really good operators, that's sort of a 10 to say 12% increase in available time.
Yep.
And they've almost always got an answer. They go, I would do this thing, which would really improve our output that I haven't been able to do because now, people are optimistic in that sense because often if we give more time back, we might just slow down.
You feel it somehow.
But I think particularly when you're talking about highly skilled people, highly motivated people, and they can come at all levels in business. You don't have to be technically skilled. You could be a skilled customer service operator, and you said the thing I'd do is I'd follow up all my at-risk customers in that day, the people that I think are on the verge of, they weren't that happy, and then that's the benefit to play back as well. So it's really going, there's a dollar value to that, but if you could productively apply that to something else, you can get a multiplier effect. Sometimes you can say we give these people back 10 to 15% of their time per month, or we could grow our business by 10%, or we could, kind of solve this other problem and cut cost out of this other area. So it can be a stretch, but I always advocate looking for that. It's like saving is one thing, but then what can you do with that saving?
Yeah.
What's the real value? What's the real value? How could you apply that somewhere else? It sounds kind of standard, but often it gets missed a bit.
Yeah.
And it makes the business case potentially more compelling.
Yep. We probably could talk like all day, but we're sort of running out of time. So I think in terms of wrapping it up, we've covered a couple of things. If you were sort of going to an enterprise, or if someone's watching this and they're working in a large business, they wanted to apply some of these things, what would you suggest? Like, where would you start? What would be the first couple of things just to start getting some momentum and just get some things underway?
Really good question. I think it's worth spending quite a bit of time understanding motivations. A little bit back to the psychology thing is what's motivating this? Whose motive is this? What are we expecting or trying to gain? And so I think it's just super important to understand the intent and the motivations at the front end and get pretty crystal on that. And so that can be a painful process. It's quite difficult to do. You've got to be quite skilled in an enterprise in having those conversations with people, because quite often people will just assert things and go, well, it's obvious, the market's moving, everyone's going digital, we have to go digital. And it's like, okay, all right, that's good, but let's try and go a bit deeper.
Yeah, why?
What are the risks of not doing digital? What does digital mean to you? Like, tell me, draw it out, that kind of thing, so that you can kind of come up with a bit of a view of what's the aspiration here, and is it really we just would like to reduce some cost and streamline some processes, maybe nudge them, versus, as we've talked about, going, we would like to be a dominant player in this, we want to double our market share, or we want to go outside from insurance into banking and lending, or whatever those things are, and so really list out those motives. These are the things we'd like to achieve, and this is why we want to go for them. And again, try and encourage people, let's not worry too much if that's a digital thing or an analog thing, or even let's just talk about.
Don't worry about what the solution is.
The motives, the objectives, and probably these days there's technology in there. There's no business that doesn't have technology, process, and people, and tech is a bigger and bigger piece. So that for me is like, if I was coming in, that's a super important starting point. I think people quite often challenge with that because they feel it might be low value, and you've got to understand, have they been trying to get somewhere for a while as well? So there can be different instances where you go, oh, actually there's already an intent that's quite well understood, it's just the execution has been problematic, and then you can probably switch more to, are we going about this the right way, or is there a better way? But there's a pretty clear intent, and it sort of stacks up that there is a reason behind that. But quite often I find that stuff is often a bit murky, and there's been a lot of strong opinion maybe, or just kind of follow a trend in the marketplace. So yeah, that's where I'd start. But equally, I've had challenges with that approach as well. So sometimes people feel like you're not getting boots on ground and, you know, rubber to the road because it's quote unquote obvious why we should do this.
Yeah.
But my view is if you can't articulate that and point to some solid evidence of why it's important to do that, then it's not obvious. And the teams may not understand it, and you could spend a fair bit of money and not necessarily progress. So it should be almost like an elevator pitch style approach of a new product going, we see this thing happening out there, we believe these things are true, we believe if we do this we'll get this outcome, and we believe if we don't, we run this risk. And if that's a solid story, great. But a lot of times in my experience it's not very solid. So I think particularly, and I'm particularly talking this kind of innovation, new product development space, very different for people who are doing solid business process improvement, you know, teams of analysts who often they can come in and go, we can do A, B, C to cut cycle time by X, Y, Z. Fine. You know, that's
very
cool.
well defined.
Yeah,
you know what the problem is.
Different story. Yeah.
What's your sort of view on the balance between planning and like action, doing something? Because I think, you know, getting back to sort of this concept around risk, I think it's quite a paradox that, particularly in large businesses, they think by managing risk, it is to spend, you know, months on planning and requirements and documentation and making sure that they've spoken to all stakeholders and they've got to all sign off, and then you spend months and months working on something where you don't even know if it's going to deliver any value. So I think that sort of balance is, so it's actually way, way riskier to take that approach. So I don't know, what's your sort of view on that sort of balance?
It's a big kind of, again, maybe I should go back to first principles. What's the risk we're trying to protect against, really? Like, what's the main risks that we'll face by trying to do this initiative or pursue this course, and the risks of not doing it? So to understand the risks you're really aiming at, so you focus on managing those and not other risks that are less valuable. And I think planning always has a place, but I think if you've got a pretty good method that's, you know, fleshed out enough that people understand those stage gates and those sort of steps, and you have the envelope set in terms of time and money, I find you need less planning because those parameters are pretty clear and people sort of understand the flow.
Much smaller steps.
And bite-sized stuff. And so, you know, it's that old classic, you know, sort of quote, waterfall versus agile. I don't think you need large periods of planning, but you got to have a plan and a set of guidelines and principles that are quite well known. And the better known those are and the more transparent things are, the easier as it is, I think, for you to then give autonomy to teams and encourage that pace and setting those gates with funding boundaries and almost that Shark Tank approach of like, tell me why we should invest in this further, helps a lot. But again, it is complex and it's easy to talk about this stuff. But if you're an existing enterprise with existing customers, existing systems, and this thing has to interface back into those, I think you need to understand your dependencies quite well. And the more dependencies that the new product or the new solution is likely to have on the existing business and infrastructure, then those need to be identified, and those links and those stakeholders do need to be involved. You've got to manage that to the minimum that's necessary. But I think one of the challenges I've seen in big enterprises is this idea to go and innovate autonomously within an area, but you actually realize they're very highly dependent on another area for certain parts of the tech stack or people resources even. So identifying dependencies early is key, and trying to minimize them if you do want to move fast. But you've got to acknowledge them and manage them if they're there. And I think that's one of the reasons to do a bit more planning. If you're pretty autonomous in terms of your tech stack and your process and resourcing, it's easier to be a bit looser with the planning and just have your framework and your governance set up.
Yeah.
If you're reliant on other people and you need to interface and deliver things across boundaries, and if you have existing tech debt and things like that, then a bit more rigorous planning and traditional project management, to be honest, is needed. The fewer dependencies, the less project management you need.
Yeah, so it's the appropriate level of planning for the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, and the level of dependencies with the rest of the business.
And some of that you could probably tackle through, having people from outside your team. So if there's someone that impacts, could come into the project team. So, sort of getting out of that sort of hierarchy approach so that you can spin up a team that's appropriate for that problem.
Embedding the right people.
And they could be people from all over the business.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be just, the tech team or just the innovation team or
I think that's the
whatever
only
it
way,
is.
right? That's the only way I've seen it work. And I know I've been at businesses, including where I am today and at Bankwest and others, where that is the case. It's like have the right people on the work. Doesn't really matter who they report to so much or what their unit is.
Yep.
It's a great point.
Yeah.
It really makes a difference, huge difference.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. All right. Hey, thanks for joining us. Really interesting. I hope if you've listened or watched the video, you got something out of it. Feel free to send through any comments or comment below or contact us if you've got any questions. But yeah, Murray, thanks a lot. Really enjoyed having you. And
it's all right, Jesse. No, look, great conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity and just great to share ideas and learnings. And if it helps someone, fantastic. Like the more the better. I love trying to deliver some value to someone. So that's kind of why I do what I do. So
yeah, great. All right, thanks a lot.
No worries. Have a good one.